we're going to start with my dear colleague Matt Gahn, who's going to talk about how sponsored open source ecosystems manage feature deployments. This will be a real treat because Matt's work is excellent. Yay! Welcome to the stage, Mr. Matt Gahn. Mm-hmm. There we go. Awesome.
Well, thank you everyone for joining us for the track and for joining us for the first talk of the track. I will be presenting on some work in progress that I'm working on along with Aaron and Darren Gergel at Northwestern. We're looking at how different sponsored open source ecosystems manage their feature deployments. I do want to shout out that this is like very much work in progress, so there's a little bit of an asterisk around everything. But it also means that any feedback or questions you ask are super wanted and would be really helpful. So that's kind of the stage setting. So sponsored open source ecosystems is kind of a laden term that means a lot of different things for different people. But for us, we're going to use it in terms of being kind of big projects like Android open source or MediaWiki that are sponsored by big kind of formal organizations, whether that's a for-profit corporation like Google or a big nonprofit like Signal or the Wikimedia Foundation. These big corporations or sponsors, I should say, support the projects through money, time, primarily by having people on staff who contribute to these projects and are paid to work on the projects. Oftentimes, the sponsors are also responsible for the reference implementation of the different libraries, whether that's Google Android or Signal or the Wikimedia platforms like Wikipedia. This means that the sponsor organization has kind of two different responsibilities. One, to maintain the library, the other to produce the reference implementation. They're very similar responsibilities, but they are not the same. And when the sponsor is responsible for so much of the engineering, that makes it a little bit dicey sometimes. So what we're interested in is how volunteer contributors end up contributing and influencing the sponsored library. When they're going up against, in kind of air quotes, full-time engineers who are maybe coordinating offline, maybe not coordinating offline, but maybe in a different kind of set of incentives and motivations. So yeah, we're interested in how and when volunteer contributors influence these sponsored kind of hybrid-ish projects. We're focusing specifically on project feature deployments because they're pretty bounded examples of technical decision making, and we're trying to use them as emblematic sites of influence and governance within the open source project. It's kind of nice and packaged, and we think like a good unit of analysis. For our empirical study, we look at 3 different feature deployments in MediaWiki. So that's the software project in PHP that is sponsored by the Wikimedia Foundation. They use it for Wikipedia, but it's also used in tons of different wikis all around the internet. We're looking specifically at Visual Editor, which is not so fun for people who were around in 2013 to have dealt with the fallout of Visual Editor. HTTPS is default also in 2013, and then the deprecation of HTTP support in 2015. Here is our kind of simplified model of the project deployment. You can see that it's pretty hard to pull apart the code development in MediaWiki with the testing and deployment on Wikimedia. Right, you write the code in MediaWiki, but you're kind of testing it in the implementation, right? Any feedback or bugs or stuff go through the platform that the code is used on. So they kind of feed off of each other, and we're really interested in how these different stakeholder populations are both contributing to the process as well as being impacted by the process, right? The Wikimedia Foundation has a lot of ownership over the deployment process on Wikimedia, but also in the development of the code. The users are obviously impacted by whatever is put in front of them. We're really interested in how these volunteer contributors can kind of get their wedge in the door, get their foot in the door, and impact things and influence things. here are the 3 cases we've selected. There's a whole bunch of like comparisons that can be made, but we selected these cases specifically because they kind of all happen in the same time frame, which means that they have a lot of shared context in terms of the organizational environment, in terms of the volunteers that are contributing to each of the projects. They're all big breaking changes that are announced on the same mailing lists. And so there's a lot of similarity, which is kind of why we ended up selecting them. But at the same time, there's some pretty key differences in terms of the duration of testing, how long users were able to get eyes or contribute bugs back to the project, back to the feature development, as well as different amounts of active solicitation of feedback from users or from contributors. Visual Editor in the announcements are saying, here's a link to the bug tracker, like please add anything you find. A little bit less so when they're turning on and off the different communication protocols. So finally, we kind of arrive at what questions are we asking about these cases, and what data are we looking at to try to get at some of these questions. We're curious about how the variance in the prior kind of comparison across the different deployment processes impact how and when contributors influence feature development, I should say. And to look at that, we're going to look at the commits to the feature, the issues. So for Wikimedia, it's like Fabricator tasks, but it's the same as like Bugzilla or GitHub issues. They're just bugs issues. And then we're also going to look at the pull requests that are linked in each issue. And then the second question is how important are communication styles to different contributor populations' task creations. And this is more like, does it matter if when you're filing a bug, you're polite about it? Right? Like if you're not working for the sponsor organization, does it matter how you like present your case for what work should be done when you're trying to figure out whether that work actually gets done? And for that, we really look at the discussion data around these bugs, these issues, and we generate some feature vectors that like represent style or like the framing of the task. I'm kind of like glossing over some of the methods, but I'm happy to talk about it more. And so first, we're going to look at when and how contributors influence feature development. Here are plots of commits to the like focal libraries around the features. The y-axis has the count of weekly commits. The x-axis has the like relative week during the feature development. It starts at 0, which is like the opt-out wide testing deployment, and it kind of goes back. So we can see that Visual Editor was just a lot shorter than the two HTTP or two communication-based features. But what's really interesting is that for at least 2 of the cases, there is a big concentration of contributions immediately around or immediately before the deployment kind of dates, right? Like right before the opt-in testing deployment, there's a bunch of activity. Right before the opt-out testing deployments, there's a ton of activity. And you can kind of imagine like right before something gets shipped out, everyone's trying to get their changes in, everyone's trying to get their code into the thing that's going to get sent out to users. And this pattern holds when we look at Fabricator tasks, when we look at the work issues or the bugs as well. We see that for opt-in testing as well as opt-out testing, there are a lot of new contributions being created. There are a lot of like work being done. And that's regardless of how long the opt-in testing or how long the feature development process is. It seems like everyone's kind of procrastinating regardless of how you structure things. And what's especially interesting is that a lot of the spike in activity are from volunteer or unaffiliated contributors. They're not from the contributors who are affiliated with the Wikimedia Foundation. But when we look at what tasks actually get solved, it's not as stark as the kind of like raw counts might show. So bear with me. This is a similar plot in terms of the x-axis showing the week over week kind of the week over week data for the duration of the feature deployment. Instead of count data on the y-axis, we have the percentage of tasks created in that week that are resolved by the end of the development process, right? So if we're looking at week 50 on the HTTP deprecation plot, we're seeing that 50% of the tasks created by volunteer contributors were like accepted by the end of the development process. Right? If some kind of like positive outcome of filing a bug is that the bug is fixed, this would be like, is the bug fixed by the time that everything goes out to users? And we see that even though the raw count data shows a big spike for unaffiliated contributions, they're fixed at about the same rate in Visual Editor, give or take. This is really, really kind of preliminary stuff, so I would love any alternative interpretations, any different ways of thinking about this. But what seems to stand out is that for like HTTP deprecation, even though Wikimedia affiliated contributors are making very few contributions, they're like all getting fixed and all getting fixed in a timely manner, which seems a little bit interesting because that's not the case for volunteer contributions down there. We're also moving on to the second research question. We're also interested in this communication style question of like whether it matters how you frame your bug or how you frame your task when creating a task and trying to get it addressed or solved. So this is another plot that we're going to take a little bit of time to step through, but it's essentially a similarity heat map of the feature vectors that we generated around communicative style or kind of rhetorical framing. The different rows are broken out by different kind of task traits. So the purple quadrant is the intersection of tasks created by volunteer contributors in the three different cases with different outcomes. So with the different outcomes, a lay hypothesis might be that if you submit something that is rude or framed incorrectly, your task will get declined. No one's going to address it. No one's going to work on it. You might think that like then you would see some dissimilarity or some difference between those tasks and the ones that are accepted. We don't necessarily see that. It seems like they're all kind of similar. The only region where you start to see dissimilarity is when you compare tasks created by Wikimedia affiliate contributors and volunteer contributors. That's where there seems to be some difference. One way to read this is that volunteers speak like volunteers and they don't speak like employees. And that doesn't matter whether or not the task, and that holds true regardless of whether the task is successful or unsuccessful. The language that you use, the framing that you kind of put your bug in doesn't seem to stand out across those axes. One kind of interesting thing is that it does seem that the Wikimedia affiliated contributors speak like the volunteer contributors in the visual editor case, like in this kind of very contentious, long arbited feature deployment, they're using a lot of the same kind of stylistic framings or rhetorical language that volunteers use all the time, but that is dislike how Wikimedia Foundation affiliates use in other settings, which is, again, kind of preliminary and something that strikes as a little odd. But as a kind of summary of what we've looked at so far, it seems like regardless of case, volunteers concentrate their contributions right before deployment events, kind of right at the last minute. And this is especially true for the opt-out testing where the feature is turned on as a default for most everyone. Also, communicative style seems to be relatively similar within contributor populations and slightly different between them. So again, volunteers talk like volunteers, they don't talk like employees, and there doesn't seem to be any variation between a successful task and an unsuccessful task in terms of how you're framing it, in terms of how you're talking about your issue that you're trying to get fixed. There's a lot to do. This is all, again, pretty kind of preliminary, exploratory. We really should fit a kind of formal model to figure out contributor influence and when volunteers are actually able to get their tasks dealt with, accepted, when they work on the task and when they're able to get like a patch submitted and merged. We're essentially trying to figure out what is done by who and when, and we need to kind of fit a model to get a little bit better of a sense of the detail on that. But once we have that, we want to compare the cases a little bit more rigorously. Like there are structural differences in how these different deployment processes were run, and looking at the different gaps or looking at the ways that the difference might be relevant is important for identifying any possible kind of design implications for future deployments moving forward. And then once we have those implications, once we have those provocations, we want to test with a broader set of ecosystems, whether that's Signal or the Android open source project or like WebKit. Like, what can we find out about how these sponsor organizations structure the way that people work on these open source projects? Because it is somewhat unique and does seem to kind of change things in a way different than like an open source project that doesn't have this big kind of multi-million-dollar elephant sitting in the room. So thank you so much for sitting and listening to the talk. Please, any feedback, thoughts, or questions would be really appreciated. I want to thank the communities on Wikimedia, or at Wikimedia, and also on MediaWiki for making their data public and available. And this work is supported by the Digital Infrastructure Insights Fund and Aspiration. So thanks to them as well. But thanks for sitting. Thanks for listening to my chat. So thank you.
I have a question slash like echoing of the framing. So the discourse analysis, the heat map thing, can you go back to that?
Yeah.
I'm really interested in this. I think it's really counterintuitive in part because oftentimes when we give presentations about like community, we're like, please talk nice to each other. And yet, this is sort of maybe pushing against some of this like, like language policing kind of discussion, which I think is interesting. There's a kind of corporate speak versus a volunteer speak, which is not quite the same as like telling people to not be mean, that I think is a subtlety that we sometimes miss. The other thing I thought, and I wanted to echo this to you and see if you think it's consistent with what's here. It sounds like in a deployment where things were going sideways, everybody kind of dropped the corporate pretense and they all started speaking like practitioners elbow to elbow. Like, is that a fair interpretation? Or did the volunteers kind of get formal in sort of act more corporate?
I think it's a little bit more of the former, but with a caveat that corporate speak is kind of like an absence, or like the employee speak is kind of an absence of speak in general. I have to like dive a little bit more into the details to feel like so strong on this, but it seems like a lot of the bugs and tasks that are filed by Wikimedia Foundation employees are pretty sparse in their justification for like why they're filing the ticket. It's kind of like this is broken, we'll fix, like 5-word thing. Whereas volunteers, like you, especially if you're not so engaged with the project beforehand, you're going to kind of go a little bit longer. You're going to talk more about who's impacted, when, and how. And it seems that in Visual Editor, when things are going sideways, the foundation employees are kind of going a little bit longer. They're going a little bit more into like, here's why this should be fixed, when and how, as opposed to most of the other time where they're like, I don't know, access blocked over here, fixed or whatever.
Is that so the green is the WMF
yes
folks, and
the lightest
is the visual editor case. So the red and orange and yellow blobs from the WMF contributors that have the reddish cosine similarity blobs, those are the ones from visual editor.
Yes.
Okay.
So like
that's they're going long.
This kind of column is visual editor tasks by Wikimedia Foundation employees that are compared to all of the other ones by volunteer employee or volunteer contributors, I should say. Yeah.
How much do you think that employees are talking to each other in places that you're not looking? Because I work for an organization that kind of has this dynamic a little bit. And I guess my second question is also like, what is your sampling like here? Like, how many volunteers and how many employees? Because in my organization, we have like a Slack, and we have private channels, and we have like daily meetings where we talk about things. And a lot of times it will be like, I will just write like decided offline, we're going with option B, like try to put as much as you can there, but sometimes like you've had a full conversation in some other channel, and it seems like volunteers would all be using the public forum as their primary channel of communication, but employees might have like secondary, tertiary modes of communication, and so like, is that, yeah, like is there just like an absence of data here?
I think there might be. I know that in theory, there's the Wikimedia Foundation and the employees are supposed to put everything on the public channel. Like to the extent to which they like that's done versus shooting someone a text or an email or a Google like a face-to-face conversation is a little bit hard to get such a solid grounding on, because I mean if you kind of like ask a question, if you ask them about it, it's largely like oh yeah, well we put everything on Y. So I think there's less absence than in like a Google case, but I'm sure that there's still a little bit of absence.
Maybe just like more implicit communication where like they all know like, oh, this is quote obvious, which I would argue it almost never is. But that there's more assumption of like shared knowledge between them, that like they don't have to be as verbose. Is that what you were kind of saying?
Yeah,
before?
yeah, I think so. And I think that's largely true. And I think, I mean, to your kind of like the second part of the question about like how much of each, there are a lot more volunteers than there are employees, and the volunteers are creating a lot more data than the employees. But there are like within the volunteer group, there are like more kind of like core volunteers that do start to like the contribution patterns look a little bit more like someone who's like engaged in something full time than someone's who's passing by. So
I was also going to ask, like, have you looked at how many of these people are like closing their own issues as an indicator of so, and how does that sort of like play into things?
yeah, I did look at that, and by and large, the Wikimedia the employees are kind of closing themselves or closing the other employees' issues. The volunteers are closing their own issue a lot less. But that should make its way into like the kind of more robust formal model as like a outcome, right? Because if you're creating something and you're closing something, you have the influence that seems
Like, oh, well, being less verbose gets your issue closed faster, but it's really just one person
exactly.
thing, they don't have to communicate with themselves.
Yeah, and so I think within this is the maybe a big asterisk is like I think some of the being less verbose gets your issue closed faster might just be like people with the shared knowledge or like the shared kind of like common sense, writing something really quick and just like someone else knowing exactly what they mean because of a meeting or because of something else and closing it within probably the organization, but also like the core group of contributors, even if that includes volunteers.
It can also be like tiny fixes,
Yeah,
like big feature.
yeah, and so that's why we're getting some of the pull request data to try to see like the size of the fix or something like that.
Can you talk a little bit more about how you determined which people were employees and which were volunteers? And were there people in your data set that moved from volunteer to employee? Because that happens a lot in the corporate open source context, right? As somebody who's worked for lots of companies, we tend to hire people who are doing good work from within the community. So I'm curious how you handled all of that.
The kind of the identity shift over time, or being a volunteer than being an employee. That's a great catch because, or like the labels right now are applied kind of cross sectionally. Essentially from the end of 2015 or something, there's a lot of internal data, or like there's like all the Wikimedia Foundation employees have to kind of like put WMF somewhere in their profile on Fabricator. So that's how we got that, and they also like register their foundation email addresses with their accounts and stuff like that. So that's where we got it from the end, but we should have the like accounting for what if someone in the middle of 2014 gets hired all of a sudden that's like a really different kind of contributing relationship or relationship to the project than they had before 2014. So yeah, that's something we should look at.
I think it's really interesting. There's something I thought of when we were discussing this was the issue of kind of like the VC funded open source projects where, I mean, I can think of something like Redis, I guess is a little bit, MongoDB, which was open source but isn't. Has there been any consideration on like looking into that type of thing? Because those are going to be, I would assume, somewhat different dynamics. They'll probably be closer to Android and Signal, but definitely very different from MediaWiki, and it also may change over time given they're going to become more corporate over time and that kind of dynamic.
Yeah, I would. I mean, so I think I would love to look at those. I think I specifically when you're talking about those like VC funded open source things, I'm thinking, or I think a little bit about like Blue Sky and like the protocol that it's built off of, where it is community oriented, but it has a very clearly defined like profit motive for the reference implementation of the library, and the extent to which they are receptive to the changes. It seems like who is like funding the organization matters a lot. I would love to, like, yeah, that's probably in the future work of like looking at the different differences between different like funding models for the sponsor organization. Yeah.
We'll talk a little bit about that tomorrow.
Just one thing, kind of dug into what I think someone was saying, which was I wondered how if you had data on sort of like a way of classifying, I guess, the contributors based on sort of like other things, which I guess would be like sort of, again, like the engagement with the project, how long they've been there, what their skill level was, and also I guess like how they communicate in their commits. I don't know if that's what you were including in that.
Oh, like in the commit messages?
Yeah, and things like that. Like, because certainly within the one I'm involved with, it's much more likely to get good feedback and be merged promptly if you do that. I don't know if that's what that graph was looking at. Was that about the commits or was it about the?
That was largely at like the issue level, because that's kind of. That's interesting because, well, like the kind of like framing we're looking at is at like the issue level, which I guess is like one kind of like tick higher than the commit level or like the PR level. But it seems that, I mean, like, yeah, the speed with which the PR gets merged or something like is more to do with the lower level thing than the higher level thing. So no, that's a good thought, like question. Yeah.
But it's effectively like
Yeah.
ways you would think have hopefully got the high level, but they are communicating very well.
Yeah. And the thing that's like a little bit more like artifact ish. Yeah.
Feedback?
Yeah.
One thing is to sort of that point, I would try to clarify your unit of analysis.
Yeah.
Because the struggle here is, right, is that you're sort of have an interaction that's going up and down in the chain. And then two is that given that you have an initial set of data that's relatively small, right? You're looking at specific cases against the structure. You might look at something like QCA to figure out your causal sort of complexity in that, in terms of generating a fuzzy set from that data and then figuring out specific cases that you can then pinpoint against to say, this is driving that, given the complexity of conversation within it from sort of a data perspective. Because the data is really interesting, right? You've got three very well-defined cases, heterogeneity-wise, like pretty solid. You could use that and use some additional methods against it. And you could probably do this with mixed methods too. You could put a secondary strand on it, use a qual strand against it to beat back the data against who's there, and say, oh, well, were those, other conversations happening that affected that, right? What's the color behind it, right? What's the sort of constructed reality that might be behind there? Which, given sort of the scope of cases, right, you don't need a lot of interviews in that regard to sort of drive that. And I think it would give it a little bit more, right, from a, just that color you wanted, sort of that lived experience.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. That's really helpful. Well, I don't want to just, thank you. That's happy to talk more in offline or in a different setting, but I want to give everyone a little bit of time back before the next chat. So thanks so much.